So by far, the most common first question I'm asked is, what franchise should I buy? And my answer is to slow down, because that is question number 3. Question number 1 is, should I even own a business in the first place? And if so, question number 2 is, should you start a business, buy a business, or buy a franchise? And if buying a franchise is the right fit for you, that's where we start talking about which one you should buy. So we'll address questions 2 and 3 in later videos, but in this video, we're going to focus on the trade-off between owning a business and having a job. We'll stack the pros and cons dollar for dollar and headache for headache to help you decide if entrepreneurship belongs on your roadmap. And if you're new to this channel, I'm Connor Gross. I'm a franchise owner and a franchise consultant who helps entrepreneurs to find the right franchise for them. I post franchise breakdowns, business model breakdowns, and tons of free resources for first-time franchise buyers. So get it all right now with the link in the description. Start off by talking about some of the advantages of having a job. And a lot of people that come to me for help finding a franchise, they only focus on the negatives of having a job, and they fail to account for some of the positives that are currently an advantage to them. And it's important to understand the benefits to your current situation, because you need to understand the trade-off if you decide to make a pivot. So the most common advantage of having a job that people talk about is a stable income and predictable benefits. And this is very much a factor, because if you have a job every other Friday or whenever your paycheck hits, you typically know how much it's going to hit, and you know how much your total comp is going to be for the year, more or less. And then you probably already have a sense for what your raise is going to look like, whether it's longevity-based or performance-based. You're going to have an idea for how your compensation is going to grow over time as you grow professionally. Certainly, if you have high overhead, you have a mortgage, you have a family to support, this is a huge advantage. And the other advantage being benefits, right? You have health insurance, you have PTO, you have a 401k match, and those are hard perks to quit. But when you really crunch the numbers about what health insurance costs in the US, I know that it's really expensive. Run the numbers on what it would be to pay, and a lot of times it still doesn't make sense to forego multiple 6 figures of upside or 7 figures of upside for a few $1,000s a month of health insurance. But nonetheless, it's a hard thing to transition out of. So income is certainly part of the comfort. Another thing is, how is your day structured? So in a job, your hours are going to typically be more defined, and you're also going to have more of a defined focus. So this is something that a lot of people don't think about, because even if you're working long hours, it's somewhat predictable, right? And you know a lot of times how many hours you're going to work and what your schedule is going to look like. When you shut down your laptop at 5, to some extent, you turn your brain off. And if you go on vacation, you have people to backfill those responsibilities that you're not always going to have as a business owner, because the responsibility starts with you. And the other thing that a lot of times people don't take into account when you get into a business is how wide the scope of your responsibilities become. Again, these are all general rules. I know that people work jobs that have very wide responsibilities, but in a business, your responsibility is the ultimate extreme of wide, because nothing happens in your business that isn't your responsibility. If you work a job, you have a job description, you have a lane of expertise, and you're more inclined to be operating within that lane of expertise, which means that your job may be hard, but to you, it's easier because it's very, very constrained around what your area of competence is. Routine is certainly helpful, but the real safety net is knowing that the worst case scenario is that you have to lean on other people on your team for support, and that's not always something that you're going to have in your job. And then another thing that people think about, the advantage to having a job, is limited downside and easy pivots. And this confuses people sometimes, because you think, okay, if I own my business, I have more autonomy to pivot. But the reality is if you own a business, it's not quite as easy to pivot as you may think. If you get into a business and you hate it, well, to pivot into something else, you either have to sell that business, you have to completely reorient that business in a way that may have more friction, rather than if you have a job, you have to leave a notice, but you can go interview for another job right off the bat. So it's important to understand that, but then the other thing is the downside perspective. Really, the worst thing that can happen to you most of the time at a job is to get fired. And again, you have the ability to go and get another job, presumably, but in a business, your downside is a lot higher than just not being able to have the income from that business anymore. A lot of times you may have debt that you've signed a personal guarantee for, you have lawsuits, there are other things that can follow you beyond the downside that might just be not having the upside that comes from your income from that business. So for a lot of people, having a job is a pretty good deal, because you have somewhat predictable income, you have clear roles and minimized risk. And provided that you show up and do your job and leave the rest behind at the end of the day, there's a reason why this model is the right model for most people, and why most people are going to stay in it for decades. But obviously, sometimes this is not what people are looking for, and that's when we start to focus on the advantages of owning a business versus having a job. So one of the most common reasons that I hear people who want to get out of a job, working a W-2 job, and get into business ownership is because they want uncapped financial financial upside. And that certainly is the case, because obviously in a job, you can make a lot of money. There are plenty of people who work jobs that make a lot more money than I do and that I ever will. So that can certainly work. But in a business at its core, what it does is it uncouples your input and your output. There are times as a business owner that over time you're going to delegate more and more things. The business, provided that it continues to grow and continues to perform financially, your output and what you get paid is going to be a lot higher relative to your input. A lot of times people think about that in a positive context, but when we decouple your input from your output, that can also be a negative thing, particularly in the early stages of business ownership. A lot of times what people find is that you may end up working more and you're going to have, on a net basis, more responsibility, even when the business is not making money. So it's important to understand the other side of that as well. But most of the time, or not necessarily most of the time, but hopefully if what you want to happen happens, in a business, you are growing equity and the business is going to continue to grow, and provided that you make smart strategic decisions, it's going to continue to thrive even if you're not putting as much into it on your end. But the appeal of business ownership isn't just financial, because another thing that I hear from people a lot is that they want freedom. They want autonomy. They want to be able to control their schedule. And a lot of times people are willing to make the trade-off of working more if it means that they're working more on their terms and they're capturing the upside of the work that they're doing. So in business ownership, you are writing the playbook between the clients you want to attract, the strategy you want to execute, and the people that you want to hire. So what that means is if you need a Tuesday afternoon off to go to your child's athletic event, you have the autonomy to clear it yourself, provided that you have done what you need to do on the front end to make that happen, right? If you want to move elsewhere, you don't need to go ask for permission from HR to do so. So total control can feel electric, but until every bad call will boomerang or can boomerang back onto your desk. So basically what this means is that instead of asking for somebody else's permission to do something, to move, to take time off, to go on a vacation, you have to understand the trade-off of, okay, if I do this, what will the impact be on my business? And you have to decide whether that trade-off is worth it. But the point is you have the autonomy to do so. And so the other thing that is important to think about in owning a business is the diversified revenue, as well as the tax component of it, which I'll talk about in a second. But when you work a job, you have ultimate customer concentration, right? Because for a lot of people, 100% of their income comes from one source, and that is their employer. And in a business, even if 100% of your income is coming from that one business, the top of the P&L there, the top line, is presumably from a diversified array of sources. If you lose one customer in your business, even if that's a big customer, say it's 10% of your revenue, that would really suck, but that's not 100% of your income. Whereas in a job, if you get laid off from your job, you are losing 100% of your income due to one decision that's made. A business, ultimately, it is letting you diversify your revenue out over a wide variety of sources. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about here is the tax code. So our tax code, in America at least, is built for business owners. It incentivizes people to put capital at risk to own their own business, because tax code, the people that make it understand that small businesses create jobs and they stimulate the economy. Obviously, when you own a business, the tax code works to your advantage in deductions. So there are things that qualify as business expenses on an ongoing basis that you have the ability to deduct and not pay taxes on for depreciation, whether it's real estate or it's equipment costs. And then there are even incentives when you sell your small businesses to avoid capital gains tax. And all of these things are built to let owners keep more of the money that they make and to defer and reinvest more of their money that they make. The hard part is that business ownership is not for the faint of heart. It is uncertain, it's demanding, and the weight is all on your shoulders. But the upside is certainly uncapped, and the freedom you have to build and change direction and capture the full value of what you create. That is why business ownership makes sense for a lot of people. So one of the first things that I do when I help people to go through the process of finding the right franchise for them is understanding what their why is. And it becomes very clear to me right off the bat whether this is somebody who is running from something or whether this is somebody who is running to something. And let me explain the difference between that. Sometimes I talk with people, a lot of times I talk with people who don't like their jobs, right? And that's very, very common, even for people that stay in their jobs indefinitely. But sometimes it becomes clear that this is just a miserable person, unfortunately. And I wish them the best in finding the right fit for them and finding the right purpose moving forward. But a franchise is not going to fix that. There's a book that was published back in the 90s that is called Wherever You Go, There You Are. And I use this over and over and over again to talk through this concept. If you're miserable in your job and you decide, oh, well, I know what will make this better, it's to go buy a franchise, that's not always going to fix that. And so that's why I put so much emphasis into working on what your why is before you go down that path. Because for a lot of people, if you're unhappy in this job, maybe that means that the fix for you is to go find another job or to transition career paths in another way rather than getting straight into business ownership. So that's why it's really important to dig into the granularity and do a lot of introspection on what really is right for you. Because ultimately a job buys certainty and a business buys possibility. And different tools make more sense for different people. And I think that something that's happened a lot in the entrepreneurship, the SMB ecosystem, is that we talk about having a job in a very, very pejorative way. And I'm guilty of this myself as well, because obviously I'm such a believer in business ownership. While I think it's important to acknowledge the possibility and the upside that exists in business ownership, it's also important to acknowledge that having a job is totally fine. And frankly, for the majority, the statistical majority of people, that is what they should do. The point is that, hey, maybe if you're not happy in your job, maybe another job would be the better fit for you. And that is your question number one, should I own a business? The answer might be no. And so maybe if you're still stuck on question number one, should I own a business or should I have a job? Maybe it's worth dipping your toe in with a side hustle and taste the chaos before you dive completely in. And I don't believe in side hustles forever, right? I think that ultimately you should decide what is going to be your main focus, but that's just a way to test the waters before you dive head first. Maybe this is where a franchise could make sense for some people, because instead of going out and buying a business, taking on a loan of $5 million, picking up a smaller, low debt business could be the right fit. And then you should choose a franchise as one of the paths to business ownership when you crave ownership and you crave a proven roadmap at the same time. Be sure to answer this question number one, honestly, about whether or not business ownership is right for you before you start to Google top franchises. And if ownership itself doesn't excite you, there's not a business that's going to fix that. But if you're serious about franchising, I help people find businesses that fit their goals. So grab my full library of franchise breakdowns and free resources in the description. And if you're ready to buy and you have at least $250,000 in a net worth and at least $100,000 in liquid capital, book a call below and let's get started working together.